Welcome to a journey back in time to ninth century Britain, a fractured land of rival kings and looming shadows. Before the sprawling Gothic cathedrals and cobblestone tourist streets of modern York, there was Eoforwic, founded centuries earlier by the Romans as the mighty fortress of Eberacombe. The city had evolved into an Anglo-Saxon trading port and the royal capital of the Kingdom of Northumbria. Using advanced AI technology to reconstruct the past, today we won't just tell you about the Viking conquest of York. We are going to drop you right into the shield wall. You will walk the muddy banks of the River Ouse, hear the clash of iron in the narrow, blood-soaked streets, and witness the violent, catastrophic event that shattered the Anglo-Saxon heptarchy and changed the course of British history forever. To understand the sheer shock of the catastrophe that befell York, you must understand the world right before the event. By the mid-9th century, this was a society rotting from the inside out. The ancient Roman walls that once projected imperial invincibility were now crumbling and in a state of terminal neglect. In some places, they were being used as pig pens. In others, the stone was being stolen to build farmhouses. The shield of the empire had become a backyard fence. But outside those walls, along the confluence of the rivers Ouse and Foss, lay the Fishergate Wick. This was the city's economic engine. It was an international emporium where merchants traded Frankish pottery, craftspeople worked bone and antler into combs, and butchers processed vast quantities of cattle and sheep. But this wealth masked a fatal political instability. The Kingdom of Northumbria was tearing itself apart in a bitter civil war. The legitimate king, Osbert, who had ruled for over a decade, had recently been deposed by a rival named Leoman, described by contemporary chroniclers as a tyrant who possessed no royal blood. The character of this civil conflict was uniquely destructive. Instead of uniting to protect their borders, Osbert and Bly fought each other, draining the kingdom's wealth to fund their private armies. They became so desperate for resources that they began systematically stealing from God. Historical accounts from Simeon of Durham tell us that they alienated vital lands from the church estates like Worsword, Tillamuth, Billingham, and Illicleaf. They seized the church's rents of grain, livestock, and honey to feed their warriors. They were entirely consumed by their own squabbles, completely oblivious to the existential threat that had just landed on the shores of East Anglia in late 865. For decades, the Vikings had been launching smash-and-grab raids on isolated monasteries like Lindisfarne, but this new force was entirely different. Chroniclers called them the Mysel Hyen Heer, the Great Heathen Army. This was a massive, highly organized coalition of warriors, and they were no longer satisfied with stealing silver and sailing home. They came to conquer and settle. According to Norse sagas, this army was led by the terrifying sons of the legendary Ragnar Lodbrok Ivar, the Boneless, Halfdan, and Ubba. The legends claim they came seeking blood vengeance against King Bly, who had supposedly executed their father by throwing him into a pit of venomous snakes. Whatever their true motives, the Vikings wintered in East Anglia, securing horses and transforming themselves into a lightning-fast, mobile strike force. And in late 866, they turned their terrifying gaze northward, straight toward the divided heart of Northumbria, York. The invasion of York was a masterclass in strategic deception. The Vikings didn't just attack on any random day. They struck on November 1st, 866, All Saints' Day. It was a major religious festival. The city's leaders and defenders were gathered inside the churches. distracted, unarmed, and celebrating. Ivar didn't need a siege engine. He just needed the gaps the Anglo-Saxons had forgotten to fix. The city's greatest defense became its widest open door. The Vikings breached the crumbling Roman walls with shocking speed, taking the city almost without a fight. The heart of Northumbria had fallen, but the nightmare was still not over. Kings Osbert and Gla had managed to escape the initial strike. Faced with the loss of their capital, the two bitter rivals were finally forced to put aside their hatred and unite. For 4 months, the Vikings fortified their new prize inside the old Roman fortress. Then, on March 21st, 867, Palm Sunday, the united Northumbrian army arrived at the gates of York to take their city back. At first, the Anglo-Saxon counterattack seemed like a glorious success. Osbert and Gla's forces smashed through the city's weak defenses, driving the Vikings back into the streets of the old Roman fortress. But they had walked right into a fatal trap. Viking warfare heavily relied on mobility and deception. The Vikings executed a brilliant feigned retreat, luring the enraged Northumbrians deep into the claustrophobic, narrow alleyways of the city center. Once the Anglo-Saxons were bottlenecked, their numerical advantage evaporated. The Vikings suddenly turned and launched a fierce, coordinated counter-assault from the front and the rear, trapping the Northumbrian army between overlapping shield walls. The battle turned into an absolute slaughter. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle grimly notes that there was an immense slaughter, and that both the kings were slain on the spot. Norse saga tradition claims a much darker fate for King Gla, stating that Ivar the Boneless captured him alive and subjected him to the agonizing Blood Eagle ritual, a gruesome execution where the victims' ribs were severed from their spine to resemble wings. Whether a historical reality or a terrifying myth, the result was the same. The Northumbrian aristocracy was utterly annihilated. The aftermath of this bloody siege reshaped the history of Britain forever. At first, the Vikings installed an Anglo-Saxon puppet king named Egbert to act as their tax collector, while the Vikings maintained military control. But in 876, everything changed. The Viking leader Halfdan returned to Northumbria. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that he apportioned the lands among his men, and they proceeded to plow and to support themselves. The Great Heathen Army ceased to be an invading force. They became landowners. Eoforwic was dead. Jorvik was born. The Vikings transformed York from a decaying post-Roman town into a booming international metropolis. They abandoned the old, undefended Wick at Fishergate and moved the population back inside the defensible walls. The Vikings didn't just move inside the walls, they fixed them. They took the Romang stone and reinforced it with Viking timber. They turned a crumbling ruin back into a fortress, but this time it was a fortress that looked toward the sea. Deep archaeological excavations at Coppergate in the 1970s revealed the incredible scale of this transformation. The Vikings laid out property plots demarcated by wattle fences that still define York's streets today. Jorvik became a powerhouse of mass production. The name Coppergate literally translates as the Street of the Cup Makers, where archaeologists found hundreds of wooden cores left over from pole lathes. And the wealth was staggering. Jorvik's trade networks stretched across the known world. Excavators uncovered silk caps from Byzantium, walrus ivory from the North Atlantic, and Baltic amber. By the 10th century, Jorvik was the second largest and wealthiest city in England, trailing only London. The legacy of the Great Heathen Army's conquest is still woven into the fabric of the region today. The Vikings eventually converted to Christianity, creating hogback gravestones, stone markers shaped like Viking longhouses but placed in Christian churchyards. Even the way people speak in northern England today echoes with the voices of those conquerors. If you walk through York, the streets end in gate from the Old Norse gata, meaning street. Words like bairn for child, beck for stream, and adel for urn were brought over on those dragon-proud longships in 866. The capture of York wasn't just a military defeat. It was the violent, chaotic birth of a hybrid Anglo-Scandinavian culture. History is rarely just a story of destruction. It is a story of how the end of one civilization becomes the foundation of the next. And tests have a way of repeating. Anyways, I'm Miles, watching the past so we can understand the present. And together, we keep history reborn. I'll see you in the next era.